Hey everyone, welcome to the second video for chapter 37. In this one we're going to be talking about the actual fighting of World War II, and there was a lot of it. You know, the title of this section is called Total War, and it really was. You know, and we'll talk more about the impact it had on the home front and that aspect of Total War in the next video. This one we're going to be going on the actual fighting in Europe, also in the Pacific and other parts of the world. You know, all wars can have effect beyond the battlefield. World War II was a little different, though. The scale of it had never been seen before. Fighting took place on numerous continents, as we've been talking about over the last few videos, but also on the sea and in the air. You know, this was the first time that planes had really been used as offensive weapons, way more than in World War I. And it was also taking place in large fields, but also in cities. You know, the kind of urban warfare nature of World War II had never been seen before. So for many reasons, this really was a different war. And there was no escaping the fighting for most people. Civilian casualty numbers were way through the roof, particularly in the Soviet Union. So every aspect of societies were thrown into winning the war, and the aftermath would be more far-reaching than ever before. Now let's start with Germany and the German conquest of Europe. Now, the first year of the war, Germany was very successful. You know, they learned from their mistakes in World War I with the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and trench warfare. And so they decided we're not going to just kind of take our time. We're going to use overwhelming force. And they used a technique known as the Blitzkrieg. Now, Blitzkrieg roughly translates to lightning war, and it was meant to overwhelm the opponent in both speed and firepower. The first wave was the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. As I said, air fighting, you know, with not only kind of the one-on-one dogfighting, because you did have that in World War I, but also the bombing capabilities of these air forces totally changed the game. So the German Air Force would soften the resistance, it heavily bombed them, and next came the Panzer tanks. And they would come in droves, and not only the tanks, but the automobiles, right? The use of trucks. It was able to transport troops so much faster than horses and carriages and basically everything that had been used since the dawning of time. You know, in these tanks, they weren't just glorified armored wagons like in World War I. They moved quickly, and they packed a big punch. They packed significant firepower. And while this was happening on land, the German Unterseeboats, the U-boats, were attacking British ships in the North Atlantic. These tactics contributed to a lot of early Nazi victories, most notably the fall of France. By April 1940, Germany had already occupied Denmark and Norway, right? So we're talking Scandinavia, and then just ran right through Belgium and the Netherlands. The French could not withstand the Blitzkrieg, and they signed an armistice in June, right? So you have the Nazi troops marching here under the Champs-Élysées, the Arc in the background, and then you have this famous iconic photo of Hitler and a couple of his top guys posing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Now, at this point, because Germany was having so much success, this convinced Italy to finally enter the war. It's kind of weird. You think Italy would have been right from the get-go, but they weren't officially in the war. But they saw how much fun Germany was having, and they decided to invade France from the south. Now, with France off the board and the USSR not yet involved, Britain was pretty much alone to fight the Axis. Hitler decided at this point to strike first, and this led to the Battle of Britain. Now, the Battle of Britain also is unique in that it was not fought on the ground. This was the first time a battle was fought completely in the air. Hitler sent the Luftwaffe to destroy as much of Britain's defenses in the hopes of opening things up for an eventual land invasion. This was known as the Blitz. The Blitz was an almost 2-month-long bombing campaign on cities, mostly London. Here you have London Bridge kind of in the forefront here and the smoke rising. But 57 days this lasted. 40,000 British civilians died, but the Royal Air Force was able to hold off a total German victory. Right, you see the kind of the iconic double-decker buses in London being destroyed, but you also have this image. Here you've got Churchill, right? The Prime Minister of Britain making his rounds. He would do this on a daily basis and kind of inspire the British people and rally the troops, so to speak. They weren't able to break the British. You know, they kind of held on to their resolve, and so Hitler was forced to hold off on his plan for invading England. Although this didn't really slow him that much. You know, the swastika flew from Paris all the way down into Athens in Greece, so they were still having a lot of success. So he says, all right, I'll put off the Great Britain for another day. My next big target is going to be the Soviet Union. Now, both Hitler and Stalin knew that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that we talked about in the previous video, that wasn't going to last very long. It was a delay tactic on both sides. Hitler wanted to conquer as much of Europe as possible first, and the Soviet Union needed time to prepare. The Soviet Union was the ultimate target for Germany, though, as it was full of elements Hitler considered undesirable, such as Slavs, who he considered to be the lowest of the European people, a lot of Jews, obviously they were big targets for him, and communists. Right, so that was just a wipe all of them out in Hitler's view, if he could. Now, this resulted in Operation Barbarossa. June 1941, Hitler ordered the largest land invasion in world history. Right, you see the main targets. They were going for the major cities along the western part of the Soviet Union. You got Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. 3.6 million troops he sent in. The vast majority of them were German, but he had some Romanian, Hungarian troops in there because they were allies with Germany. And it was initially successful. They used the Blitzkrieg attack and they stampeded through Russia the same way that they stampeded through France and Western Europe. And they reached Moscow within 6 months. However, the Nazis underestimated the level of Soviet resistance that they would encounter. Stalin had concentrated all of the USSR's industrial efforts on war. They also received a lot of supplies from the Allies, especially the United States, even little things such as boots for the soldiers to wear during the winter. Speaking of winter, the Nazis, they underestimated it. Okay, the Russians had the worst winter in decades, and the overconfident German army was not prepared. They thought that they'd be out of there. They thought they would have conquered Moscow by then. All of a sudden, it's 20, 30 degrees below, and these guys are in trouble. That being said, there were also a lot of casualties on the Soviet side as well. The siege of Leningrad was particularly brutal. Okay, it lasted over 2 years, and tens of thousands of Russians, or I should say hundreds of thousands of Russians, lost their lives due to starvation, disease, and in the fighting as well. So despite the heavy casualties, they stood their grounds, though. They were not able to break, but neither did the Germans. Okay, the winter didn't totally defeat Hitler the way that it did Napoleon back in the 1800s, and they were able to regain the offensive by the summer of 1942. We'll come back to them in a second when we talk, actually in a couple minutes when we talk about Stalingrad. First, let's go into Asia and the Pacific. So, prior to December of 1941, the Japanese Empire was largely unchecked in their conquest of the Pacific. It was becoming more apparent, though, that the U.S. could not sit this war out. Before declaring war, the U.S. committed itself to helping the Allies, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and so forth. This led to growing tension between the U.S. and Japan. It started with the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act made the United States what they called the arsenal for democracy, right, to our allies. Here you've got Britain, you've got the Soviet Union, you've got China, and it was, exactly what it sounds like. They lent supplies, even tanks, naval vessels, as I said, boots to the Soviet Union. And while this was happening, the Japanese saw an opportunity to take European colonies in Asia. All right, this is what Southeast Asia looked like in 1895. And you see all the ones you got British Burma and Malaysia. You've got the Dutch Indies. That was a big one for them. You've got French Indochina, which is today Vietnam. Well, all of these are either fighting Germany or they're already conquered by Germany, such as the Netherlands and France. So Japan figures this is prime opportunity for us to go in and take over those territories. The U.S. saw this as a very unnecessary move of aggression, and so they decided that they were going to freeze all of the Japanese assets and impose a very strict oil embargo on Japan until they toned things down. The Japanese government, though, which was led by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, they saw this as another step towards war with the U.S. and figured that it was inevitable. So they decided that they are going to strike first, resulting in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan hoped to destroy America's Navy in the Pacific, thwarting its ability to attack Japan itself. And on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, more than 350 Japanese bombers attacked the Navy base in Hawaii, striking major damage to the fleet. The only saving grace was that the aircraft carriers were not there. They were out kind of on maneuvers in the Pacific. So the U.S. immediately declares war on Japan, and then Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. a few days later. Even though it didn't knock the U.S. out completely, the attack on Pearl Harbor was still a devastating blow and led to a string of Japanese victories. All right, so 1942, this is what the Japanese Empire looks like. They've got all of the Korean Peninsula and then those big sections of China and then pretty much all of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines in here. They would run bombing raids as far south as the north coast of Australia. They had Hong Kong, they had Thailand, they had British Malaysia, all these tiny islands in here as well. Especially embarrassing for the Allies was the British surrender of Singapore. All right, down here in Malaysia. This shattered any myth of European invincibility against the Japanese, and it also gave tremendous confidence to Japan that they could beat the Allies. So let's get into the defeat of the Axis. The entry of the Soviet Union and the U.S. In 1941 was huge. Now Germany had to fight a two-front war against the USSR and American reinforcements in Europe. Plus, Japan had now finally a legit enemy to fight against in the Pacific. Plus, on top of all this, American industrial production far outpaced that of Germany and Japan. All right, the Americans back in the home front, especially women, they were churning things out of those factories. Let's first look at the victory in Europe. 1943, Germany had lost the momentum to Russia. A lot of this was due to the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad turned out to be a decisive turning point. The German army was turned back and was finally being driven out by the Red Army. Here you have the iconic image of the Soviet soldier waving the red Soviet flag to signify victory in Stalingrad. It was brutal fighting, but the Germans were now being pushed back through Eastern Europe into Germany, and they were being pursued by the Red Army. This would have serious implications not only for the end of World War II, but also for the Cold War that would follow. We'll get to that later, though. Now, on the western side, the big turning point was D-Day, June 6, 1944. It was the largest naval invasion in world history as Allied forces, both American and British, decided that they are going to push across the English Channel into Normandy Beach here in northwest France, and then to gain a foothold, push their way through. Right, you've got the iconic images of the duck boats landing there, and because it was successful, it allowed further reinforcements to come in, and as I said, they got their toehold, their foothold, if you will, and then pushed the Germans from the opposite direction back into Germany. So what Hitler now is looking at is both fronts are collapsing. You've got USA and Britain coming in from the west, you've got the Soviet Union coming in from the east. And as the fronts collapse on both sides, the Soviets had already made it into Berlin, and now you've got VE Day, Victory in Europe. The Germans surrendered on May 8th, 1945. All right, and here you see the celebrating British citizens knowing that the war is now over in Europe. Hitler wasn't even there to witness it as he had committed suicide in his bunker a week earlier. However, the war is not over completely because you've still got Japan. So let's look at that with turning the tide in the Pacific. Now, the Japanese onslaught came to a halt at an important Battle of Midway. The U.S. was victorious mostly because of its aircraft carriers, which, remember, weren't at Pearl Harbor, but also they were able to crack the Japanese code, giving them a heads up of Japanese strategy. Now, the battle strategy that the U.S. adopted was known as island hopping. Remember, we said all of these islands, they were vital to winning control of in order to win the war. The reason being is that planes in the 1940s couldn't do direct bombing runs across the entire Pacific, nor could a large-scale naval invasion, right? You couldn't just sail across the Pacific without running into serious problems. So in order to attack Japan itself, the U.S. had to first take all of the little islands in the Pacific to use them as stepping stones for the eventual attack on the big target of Japan. All right, so here you see Midway, June of 1942. All right, that was going to be the big turning point, and now they were going to work their way through all of these other ones as well. The fighting on these islands, like on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, all right, they were fierce and brutal, but the Americans emerged victorious in them. You have the very iconic shot, and now a memorial of American Marines hoisting the flag on Iwo Jima. Plus, but one of the reasons why they were so brutal and fierce was because the Japanese refused to surrender. But taking these two islands, now that meant that they were in striking distance of Japan. Okay, firebombing attacks on Tokyo, they decimated the city. A quarter of the buildings were destroyed. Over 100,000 people were dead. But the decisive blows came with the droppings of the atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the U.S. was the first to develop this new revolutionary weapon, and on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, instantly killing over 70,000 people. Tens of thousands more died later of injuries and radiation poisoning. And then by the time the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, the Soviet Union had already declared war on Japan. These combined threats to his people forced Emperor Hirohito to surrender, and this was known as VJ Day for Victory in Japan. So on August 15th, 1945, the Japanese emperor made his unconditional surrender to the Allies, and World War II was officially over. And here you have the iconic shot of an American sailor celebrating in Times Square in New York. All right, so a lot in that one, but that covers kind of everything in the fighting in World War II, and in the next video, we're going to be talking about kind of the societal impact of it.